It's about to start. And I'll let you introduce yourselves a little bit too, because I'll get it wrong. Hello, Rob and Micah. Thrilled to have you here live from the Netherlands, not so live. I will let you introduce yourself and to our master's students. And we will sort of unravel why we're all having this conversation with a series of questions and see where we go. Micah or Rob, whoever wants to go first, perhaps just
ladies first, Patrick.
Ladies first. Micah, take it away.
Thank you. My name is Maaike Pebisma and I work for the province of Utrecht. We have in Holland or the Netherlands, whatever you want to call it, we have 12 provinces. So Utrecht is right in the middle. And my projects are that I change agricultural land to nature. So we have a whole map of Holland where there should be nature, and we have over 50% of our land is agricultural land. While we are very densely populated, so it's a strange division, I think. But so we don't have a lot of nature, and so that's what I work on. That I talk with farmers and see if they want to sell their land. But it's all voluntary, so sometimes it works and sometimes not. And then I make plans, and it's sort of gardening, but then big areas. So that's how it works in Holland. That we make nature. There's quite some nature from long ago, but we make nature too. And that's long processes. And yeah, what's interesting for this course also is that a lot of the projects that I work in are in you don't call it swamp areas. What is it, Rob? The peat areas. And we make swamps there for the birds and the plants. But some of them are almost 7 meters below sea level. So it's very interesting that we make swamp there, because then the people around there feel a bit scared that they don't want their cellars to get wet, or worse than that. But that's what I do.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'm dying to talk more about it. Hello, Rob.
Hi, Patrick. Yeah, well, I'm in the lucky position that I'm a retired man. But all my professional life, I used to work for the national government, almost all my professional life. I worked for the Ministry of Nature and Agriculture. But I did a lot of projects which involved also the Ministry of Water Management and Spatial Planning. And I've dealt with several programs. And Patrick, you mentioned Ruimte voor de Rivier, Room for the River. Within projects and organizations that dealt with that. Interesting is when Patrick, you asked us to join you, is I had to think back quite a lot, because the program Room for the Rivers is actually invented like already about 35 years ago, which originally was a nature measurement to create wet nature, knowing that you would buffer natural water within the national water system. Now, we had in the Netherlands quite a huge flooding in the 1990s, and people had learned from the initial Room for the River. I mentioned the plan Stork to you, Patrick, from that initial program, that it worked to buffer the system from both sides, against drought and against too much water. So what happened then is there was an official governmental commission and commissioner, which is called the Delta Commissaris, who deals with sea level rising, with problems getting too much water, because Maaike mentioned we are a low country, and we get all our water from, say, Eastern Europe, the mountains from Switzerland, etc. And due to climate change, that fluctuates, of course, a lot more. So we had an official government body that deals with that. I was involved in quite a few programs, and you mentioned that too, and maybe I should mention that I worked for the organization that dealt with which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, called the New Dutch Waterline, Nieuwe Hollandse Waterlinie, which was a system, and that's quite interesting, that defended the Netherlands through water management. So I've done a lot in this field. I don't do anything at all with it now, but it's still a very interesting subject. And when you told us, Patrick, what's going on in your country, I think you can, and your students can learn a bit from what happens here. And I would certainly invite them to come over to Holland, and if they're interested in that, to see what's going on.
What a wonderful invitation. Thank you, both of you. So the students' site is a suburban one, very near our international airport, and it has a community that seems to know nothing and have zero awareness of the forecast sea level rise that seems quite imminent when one looks at the science behind it, as it's one of the lowest areas of Sydney. So, Micah, if I ask you a question first, I'm quite interested in perhaps some of the not the fringes of agricultural areas, but where you had challenges of convincing people. So sort of the social side of the buyback idea, or forced acquisition, it gets called here in Australia. So this idea of, were all the community always aware of it? Did you ever have to be the pioneer of that concept, or it was coming from much higher up from you, so to speak? So I'm interested in where there was a bit of a wrestle, where you had to convince people, if you've got any examples like that.
Yeah. It's a very good question. I mean, it's a real big part of the stress part of my job. Yeah, because like with projects like Room for the River, then people can be forced to sell their land, because that's for the safety of our country. So yeah, then you can have this expropriate land from, it's always from farmers. But we don't do that for nature. I mean, that's a political choice. For nature, it's all voluntary. So it takes a lot of effort to convince farmers and try to make a scheme that it's profitable for them too. But maybe you and some of your students have read about the nitrogen problem in Holland, and so the farmers produce a lot of nitrogen, which is bad for everyone and especially for nature, and so they should cut that down. And so they say we need more land, because then we can divide the cows more over the land instead of less. So for the last years, my talks with farmers have been much more difficult, because they're just so angry that and then I'm from the province, but and not from the national government, but still they're very angry at me then, because I have plans for their land, and they want to be a farmer forever and don't know what to do, what else to do, just in short. And so it's the last year it's been much more difficult, because our government doesn't want to save, to force them. I mean, that would be a solution in the end. Somehow, some way, that will be the solution. They will have to choose that, but for the last decades, and that's still so, that they don't do that. So then it's all voluntary, and it just, we have a whole scheme when all this nature area should be ready, should be made so it can evolve, so it can really become nature. But it takes much longer. So yeah, it takes a lot of effort to get something
to convince, to turn it around. Michael, Rob mentioned the floods of the 90s. I'm assuming that gave people a very visual and physical reality check. Is that something you tend to refer back into? In a sense, I guess I'm asking, you've had a calamity and a disaster in people's very much living memory. So does that become a card you can pull out in the game?
That's a good question, Patrick, because I think the community's memory on how things work and what the problem is, if it's not acute, as Mike describes it, it isn't felt as a big problem. And you mentioned the word disaster. You need a disaster, and we had a semi-disaster in the 90s. Again, we had like 3-4 years ago in the south of the country, we had another flooding, and that wakes the people up. But dealing with it with support from that same community, because of course it affects them in their everyday life, is hard to do. And it's a discussion, as Maaike describes as well, as where you put the responsibility to act, to really act, and how forcefully one can act. Maaike described after the 1990s flooding, it was a centralized, as I described it, a governmental body with loads of money, with judicial power, which could just remove people from the land, and of course they would get paid for their loss of land, etc. House, they would be offered a new house, but that seems to be a mechanism which is, and Maaike says that too, which is needed to push people across that barrier. Where, of course, if I have to move from my house because a scientist tells me that the sea level will rise within, decades, that's a tough one, So that's how it happened. And we talked a bit beforehand, before the interview. It's a political thing as well. I asked you whether the community accepts the professional judgment of scientists like you, that this is indeed a big problem. And what I find and what I read in the papers here, it's still not 100% synced in that, and apparently in your country it's the same.
Correct. It is absolutely the same. I love listening to you both. It occurs to me, and it's a question for both of you, do you find there's a need to have local champions in whatever area you're dealing with that can almost speak for you? So by that I mean people that are perhaps non-politicians, but are on board with what you're doing. And do they become access points for you? Mike or Rob, perhaps you could speak into that.
Maaike can tell you something about it. Like you have ambassadors for what you do. Yeah, Maaike.
No, yeah, but I think it should be a political decision. I mean, it just takes years and years, all voluntary, and I think we need a government that says, well, this has to be done, and just force everyone. That's my private opinion.
I will take that. I will take
that's a political one as well. Sorry to interrupt. But at the same time, it helps, and that's what your question asks, that if you have ambassadors, which are like farmers in Maaike's example, which are frontier men, so to speak, that helps in interaction between governments and the local societies, of course, that helps.
Yeah, true. That's true.
Yeah, and not sadly, we don't have a calamity to refer to so neatly as a flooding in certainly in the Rockdale area, the students, that has caused such loss of life as you've had in the Netherlands. We've certainly had it further north, up near Byron Bay, in the last spell. So it's the idea of flooding, the idea of sea level rise is within people's minds, but it's not frontline. And this idea of community, I mentioned before we started, I attended a whatever it was called, disaster kind of lecture yesterday, and the outcome of that was a very salt of the earth expression, a salt of the earth bloke who has worked with some of the not-for-profits for many years, and this is his special thing. And he said, for all the preparedness you could ever hope, and for all the money that government brings, it's all bells and whistles, and at the end of the day, the most important thing is that somebody's got the keys to open up the emergency safe space. And he said, things happen, people want to know, they don't want to be the RSL. The RSL is Return Services League Club, and there's alcohol there. And these things were presumed, and it turns out people don't want that. People have alcohol problems. Who's going to open the door? Who's going to serve the food? None of those things are organised, and suddenly a calamity happens, and he said it's awful. It's utterly awful. And I just wonder if there's a sort of role in this before sea levels rise, we step into a it's going to happen mentality, how we prepare people for this. So perhaps, you know, there is a difference and not a difference between the Netherlands and this site. I think the Netherlands is ahead of the game. And certainly there's a deeper conversation to have with, wow, you know, sea levels are rising and the impact on the Netherlands, and how much we want to step into that conversation. But this idea of preparing people and local people, I think is something I'm interested in our students developing in this 5 kilometre stretch. So yeah, I'm interested in any ideas you have around that.
It's interesting when you said this, Patrick, that our country is, I mean, the national awareness about this kind of problem, dealing with water. Of course, we had a remembrance on television very recently in February, where we remembered a flooding in the province of Zeeland, which is in the west, in 1953, which was caused by well, not high enough dikes, storm winds, etc. But the awareness of in the whole country about having to deal with water, with having to deal with water rising, having to deal with etc. is, I think, quite high. Still, having to deal with law enforcement, so to speak, by governments, there's still a lot of work, as Mike stated. There's still a lot of work to do if it affects individual people. So I think the situation where you're dealing with in Australia compared to the Netherlands is very different. What might help, and I think by just letting people literally see what happens if you don't act. Of course, there are countries quite near to you where sea level rising is causing the community immense problems already. If it's close by to people, and you can show that to them, and still, of course, there are other things that are on people's mind, but it's probably just keep on hammering that there is a problem, and there's a role for the government there as well. If it's not on the news about every day that this is going to happen and this is a big problem, people will dodge and go into their everyday life problems. And what I find too, Mike mentioned the nitrogen problem here in the Netherlands. You can make that a very scientific with data, etc., etc. people must be able to feel how it affects their everyday life. And if you can show people that, look, if this is going on, we have a film clip from the south of the Netherlands, then this is going to affect you sooner or later as well. I think people tend to wake up more.
Yeah, that's good.
So many people are just in denial and think we'll just make the dikes higher and that will stop the sea from coming in. But there, another problem is in the meantime that we have shortage on fresh water, because we've always been busy the last million thousands of years by that all the water that comes from all the mountains, the Alps, that goes through Holland, and that has to go as quickly as possible to the sea. But now we have a shortage of fresh water, drinking water, but also for all the agricultural land, and all the nature is drying up, and so. Yeah, so you can put high dikes, but then still you have to keep the fresh water also in the country. And there's a big salt layer under Holland before, because a million of years ago it was still sea. So all I think you call it seepage, the water that from high gets under the ground and gets up, is salty as well, which is not good for nature or for agriculture or for drinking water. So we have a lot of problems, water concerned.
Many different systems. All right, I now want to stop talking to you as professional people, and I just want to talk to you as Dutch people with an opinion. So as an Australian sitting here in Sydney, I do myself personally have, I think I'll tell you what I think is happening. I think the sea level is going to rise, and it'll be a little ad hoc, and it'll be at the peak of its tide, and we'll have tidal flux, and then it will gush in and gush out, and then I think, oh, will it just seep in? And I just can't quite get my head around it. And then in the Netherlands, I think the Alps and the Rhine, and it floods down into the delta, and then you've already built barriers at the front to keep that sea out. And then I'm assuming as it gets higher at a high tide, and perhaps at a king tide, when the earth and the moon and the sun align up and it stretches that tide, it will surge in. And I'm assuming that is when your huge infrastructural tidal gates close, or if they're always closed. So I guess I have a question about your tidal gates, and is that going to be the solution? Do you think that's going to be the solution everyone is doing? Certainly Singapore, Manhattan, people are stepping into these large-scale infrastructure projects. And I ask that in the sense that the Room for the River program is allowing more water everywhere. Oh God, my head spins. So I guess, yeah. Do you think it'll surge or seep? There's a question.
That's an interesting one, and that's a discussion that's going on here as well, because we have these big barriers built, which keep out the high tides as they are now. But of course, there are already scientific data that prove that these big barriers won't work if the water really rises. And there are very slowly discussions going on. Even, and you know where we live, Patrick. We live halfway the country, which is tiny, of course. We live about 70 kilometers from the sea. But we, as Mike has stated, we live below sea level. Is it a sustainable solution to keep hiring your dikes, or do we have to move further east with a whole civilization within? And that's one of the problems. It's the time scale within 100 and 150 years. I'm a long time dead then. And so I don't feel it as my problem, and that's a very hard thing to bring across. That, well, we won't. It's the problem of our grandchildren, so to speak. I think
a lot of people know, because I mean there's a lot of information about that, and it looks a bit like fun, but it's very serious. But there
Very
are whole
serious.
maps. When the sea level rises, where can we still live? That we all have to live to, and to go to Amersfoort, just a bit to the east. But then I think that's and the half of Holland will be water. But yeah, that's only part of the problem. I mean, then we are very densely populated, as I said, and then we all have to move. But the whole world will be moving. I mean, there will be
Going
so
up.
many countries where you can't live anymore, and they will come here also, which is their good right. But yeah, I don't know. It will be crazy, but yeah, like I think that's everywhere. People just don't want to think about it because it's huge. Ooh,
It's huge.
sorry, that's a
And
bird to the
what we have
window.
to realize as well, Mike and I talk a lot about it. We're kind of an elite that knows on scientific basis what's going on, what's the problem. And I think that a lot of people, and that's not a judgment, but don't realize what is going on. And that's a message for, well, for students as well, to get that across with examples and make it tangible for people that don't deal with it every day. And that's a hard job.
It's a very hard job. Councils don't want to know about it. They're just starting to use terms like planned retreat and rezoning. And I wonder, are they terms that are coming up in your world?
Yeah. And what I was thinking too is that's a discussion on how to get your message across is and therefore the example I gave with the planned stork is quite interesting, that it's not only a threat, but you can also gain something for society with the measures you take. And I think that's an interesting one to think about. What not only see the seawater rise as a threat, but can you get something out of it which helps in another way? I don't know how that is in Australia, but that's
A nature
how
reserve.
I'm trying to deal with it as well.
Thank you. I will end this there. But it's just wonderful and generous of you to give us your time. And I know I've enjoyed it, and I hope the students will as well. So goodbye to you both over in the Netherlands. And I might give you a call back in half an hour.
Thank you, Patrick, and good luck to you and all the students, but because they have a thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye. Yo, koffie.